I was never supposed to be in courtroom 4B that morning. My name is Vivian Reeves, and I have spent 22 years as a police sergeant in the city of Branton. In all that time, I had sat through dozens of hearings, noise complaints, minor disputes, the kind of forgettable cases that fade before you reach your car. That Tuesday, I was there for a scheduled witness statement in a theft case 3 doors down. The theft case was delayed, and so I slipped into the nearest open courtroom to wait. I wish I had gone for coffee instead. The room was packed. Families sat tightly together, clutching papers, their eyes fixed on the front. At the defendant's table stood a woman I would later learn was named Lydia Carter. She was thin and tired in the way that comes from too many sleepless nights. Her young son sat behind her in the gallery, no older than 8, gripping the edge of her coat with both hands. Opposite her sat a man I did not yet recognize. He wore a dark blue suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary. His posture was relaxed, almost bored, like the outcome had already been decided and he was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. When the judge read his ruling, eviction granted, damages confirmed, Lydia's voice cracked as she tried to speak. She insisted the charges were fabricated. The judge cut her off without even looking up. Then, just for a second, I saw it. The judge's eyes met the man in the blue suit across the room. A brief glance, knowing, deliberate, satisfied. Something cold moved through me. The ruling was official before Lydia could finish her sentence. A security officer guided her firmly toward the side exit. She did not cry. She just walked with her chin down, one hand reaching back for her son without looking. The boy scrambled after her, his small sneakers squeaking against the courtroom tiles. I followed them into the hallway at a distance. The man in the blue suit, the landlord, I had gathered from the brief mentions inside, moved through the corridor like he owned it. He probably did, in some way. He paused near the water fountain, straightening his cufflinks, and when Lydia walked past with her son, he turned slightly and said something low enough that I could not catch every word. But I caught enough. You should have known your place from the beginning. His tone was not angry. It was worse than that. It was casual. The kind of cruelty that comes from never once being told no. Lydia did not respond. She pulled her son closer and kept walking. I watched the man smooth the front of his jacket, then I noticed it, a small, quick movement near the clerk's station outside the courtroom door. The landlord reached into his breast pocket, produced something small, I could not tell exactly what from where I stood, and pressed it into the clerk's hand as naturally as if he were passing car keys to a valet. The clerk did not look at it. He just nodded once, slipped it into his own pocket, and turned away. A reporter nearby snapped a photo of Lydia. Nobody photographed the exchange I had just seen. I was still standing near the water fountain when the landlord walked past me. He did not look at me. Why would he? I was just another person in a crowded hallway, an ordinary woman in a gray jacket, holding a manila folder under my arm. He moved quickly, radiating the particular confidence of someone who had just gotten exactly what he wanted. And then he laughed. It was a short sound, barely more than a breath, shared with the assistant who trailed 2 steps behind him. But something about it reached into a part of my memory I had not touched in a very long time. That laugh. The shape of it, the way it rose and fell with exactly the same rhythm as something I had heard before, somewhere dusty and unlit, late at night, standing over a file that would eventually be closed without resolution. I turned and stared at the back of his head as he pushed through the corridor doors. The width of those shoulders. The way he held his chin high. The slight roll in his step. 20 years is a long time. People change their hair, their weight, their address. Some change their names if they need to. But certain things do not change. The way a person laughs is one of them. I had heard that laugh in a recording, a grainy, 30-second piece of audio attached to a complaint filed by a tenant in the Weston Park district. My jaw tightened. I muttered the name from the old file almost without meaning to, just a breath, barely a sound. The man's step faltered. Just slightly. Just for a half-second. But I noticed. I drove back to the precinct without stopping for lunch. The records room at Branton Police Department was in the basement, a long, windowless space that smelled of old cardboard and recycled air. Most officers avoided it when they could. I had spent more time there than I liked to admit. I knew exactly which section held the pre-digital cold files. I went straight to the shelf marked H and started pulling. It took me 40 minutes to find it. The folder was thin, thinner than it should have been for a case involving multiple families, and the tab was handwritten in faded blue ink. Hale Properties Investigation, suspended. I carried it to the table under the fluorescent light and opened it slowly. The documents inside were brittle at the edges. Complaint forms, tenant statements, financial summaries with large sections blacked out. Someone had moved through this file before me with a redaction pen and no intention of explaining why. But enough remained. The statements described a pattern: landlords entering properties unannounced, damage appearing before court dates, judges ruling in favor of the landlord despite contradicting evidence. Tenants reported intimidation. Several said they had been warned not to show up in court. The name listed as the primary suspect was Victor Hale. I turned to the witness contact sheets near the back of the folder. Names and addresses, most of them probably outdated by now. Then I stopped. Halfway down the third page, in the column for tenant statements, was a name I recognized immediately. Raymond Carter. Lydia Carter's father. I sat with that folder for a long time. The fluorescent light above me hummed steadily, and the records room stayed empty. I read through every page twice, then a third time, cross-referencing dates, addresses, and case numbers. The pattern was not subtle once you knew what to look for. Victor Hale had been operating the same scheme across different properties for at least 25 years. The method never changed. He would acquire a building, wait for long-term tenants to feel settled, and then begin. Small complaints first, things that could be argued either way. Then photographs of damage, submitted as evidence before tenants even knew hearings were scheduled. Then a court ruling, almost always in Hale's favor. Almost always under the same judge. I pulled the court records attached to the file and checked the names. The same judge, the same man who had sat on the bench that morning, appeared in rulings from 11 years ago, 14 years ago, and again 17 years back. Each time, the decision had gone to Hale. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. A judge assigned randomly to unrelated cases might appear twice, maybe 3 times in the same landlord's history. But 7 times? Across different courtrooms and different districts? That required something far more deliberate than luck. The question was no longer whether Victor Hale was running a corrupt scheme. The question was how deep it went, and whether anyone with the power to stop it had been deliberately looking the other way for 20 years. While I was still in the records room, my phone buzzed. It was a message from a colleague, a quick note saying the witness statement I had originally come to the courthouse for had been rescheduled. I barely registered it. I drove to the Weston Park district after my shift ended. The building Hale had been trying to clear was a 4-story block near the edge of the neighborhood, brick walls, a narrow entrance, flower pots on a few of the windowsills that told you people had lived there long enough to care about the place. It did not look like much from the outside, but it had the settled feeling of a home that had belonged to people for a long time. Eviction notices were taped to every door on the ground floor. Lydia had arrived back to this scene after leaving the courthouse. She had stood in the corridor with her son beside her, reading notice after notice, her face going still in the way that happens when a person realizes the problem is far larger than they first thought. She knocked on her neighbors' doors. One elderly couple would not open theirs. A woman across the hall came out just far enough to whisper that Hale's people had visited 3 days earlier. They had told the tenants that if anyone spoke to lawyers or reporters, the eviction process would be sped up and their records flagged. By the time I reached the building, Lydia was sitting on the front steps with her son asleep against her shoulder. She looked up when I approached. "Sergeant Reeves," she said. "Yes," I said. "We need to talk." We sat in the small community room on the ground floor, just the 2 of us, a folding table between us, a single overhead bulb casting yellow light across the old case folder I had spread open. Lydia listened without interrupting. That surprised me. Most people asked questions every few sentences. She just sat with her hands folded in her lap and read each document I slid across the table. When she reached the witness contact sheet, the page with her father's name, she went very still. "Raymond Carter," she said quietly. It was not a question. "You recognize the name," I said. "He was my father." She set the page down carefully. "He died 6 years ago. Heart failure. But when I was a teenager, he told me once that we had moved out of our old apartment because of problems with the landlord. He never explained exactly what had happened, he just said it wasn't worth fighting." She paused. "I always thought he gave up too easily." I let the silence settle before speaking. "He didn't give up," I said. "He filed a complaint and gave a full statement. Someone buried it." Lydia looked at the folder. Her expression was hard to read, not quite anger, not quite grief. Something caught between the two. "So Hale did this to my father's family too," she said. "Almost certainly." "And now you think he bribed the judge?" "I think he has been doing it for a long time," I said. "But thinking is not enough. We need proof, the kind that holds up and cannot be buried again." The flash drive came from the last person I expected. His name was Albert, 73 years old, 3rd floor, apartment 3C, the kind of man who remembered the name of every postman who had ever served the building and kept a handwritten record of every maintenance request he had ever filed. He had lived there for 19 years. When Lydia knocked on his door the following morning, he opened it immediately, as though he had been expecting her. I was with her when he sat us down at his kitchen table and slid a small black flash drive across the vinyl tablecloth without saying a word. We asked him what it was. Albert told us that the hallway security camera near the stairwell on the ground floor had been installed by the previous building management. Hale's team had never bothered to remove it, probably because they did not notice it. The camera fed to a small recording unit inside the utility closet, which Albert had been quietly maintaining on his own for the past year. "I noticed things," he said simply, "things that shouldn't have been happening." His hands were steady as he folded them on the table. He told us that over the past 3 months, he had seen Hale and one other man, a younger one, enter the building using a master key during afternoon hours when most tenants were at work. They would go into apartments and stay for 15 to 20 minutes. "Always the day before a court date," Albert said. He picked up his tea and looked out the window. "Always with bags." We watched the footage that evening on Lydia's laptop in Albert's kitchen. The camera angle was narrow. It covered only the ground floor corridor near the stairwell, but it was enough. The timestamp in the corner read 4 days before Lydia's eviction hearing. The image was grainy but clear enough for identification. Victor Hale walked into frame at 2:14 in the afternoon. He wore the same blue suit I had seen in the courthouse. Beside him was a younger man carrying 2 large duffel bags. They used a master key to enter Lydia's apartment. They were inside for 18 minutes. When they came back out, the bags were noticeably lighter. I asked Lydia to tell me exactly what the judge had cited as evidence of damage in the ruling. She recounted from memory: broken tiles in the bathroom, a fractured kitchen cabinet, deep scratches across the living room floor. She insisted she had never reported any of it because it had not existed. I believed her. We rewound the footage and watched it again. Then I noticed something that stopped me cold. At 4:47 in the same afternoon, more than 2 hours after Hale had left, a different figure appeared in the corridor. A man in a light gray jacket. He stopped outside Lydia's apartment, glanced down the hallway in both directions, then knocked. No one answered. He slipped a folded paper under the door and left. I had seen that jacket before. It belonged to the clerk who had been standing outside courtroom 4B the morning of the ruling. Evidence from a hallway camera was a start. It was not enough. I spent the next 2 days working through channels I had built over more than 2 decades, officers who owed me favors, a forensic accountant who had helped me on 3 previous cases, and a financial investigator attached to the district corruption unit who agreed to look at what I had without making it official yet. The forensic accountant's name was Petra. She was thorough, methodical, and difficult to impress. When she called me back after reviewing the documents I had sent, her voice was quieter than usual. "There's a company called Vantage Property Holdings," she said, "registered in a different county. It appears in the financial records attached to several of Hale's properties as a consulting firm. But there's no working website, no registered office that checks out, no employees on record." "A shell company," I said. "3 of them, linked together. Money moves through each one before landing in a personal account." I asked her whose account. She paused. "The account is registered to a woman named Constance Briggs." I did not recognize the name immediately. I asked Petra to run it. She called back 20 minutes later. Constance Briggs was the sister-in-law of the judge who had ruled on Lydia's eviction. I sat down slowly. The bribery was not being paid directly to the judge, it was routed around him, through a relative, disguised as legitimate consulting fees. It was a cleaner method than most, and it would have remained invisible without someone looking very carefully. Someone finally was. Things began to move faster after that. The district corruption unit quietly assigned 2 investigators to work alongside me. We kept the operation small. The fewer people who knew, the less chance of information reaching the wrong ears. I had worked enough corruption cases to understand that leaks could come from anywhere, and a man like Victor Hale did not stay ahead of trouble for 20 years by being careless. He must have sensed something shifting. I learned from one of the investigators that a contact inside Hale's office had reported a sudden change in his behavior. He had stopped holding meetings in his main building and begun conducting calls from a different location each day. He had also reached out to the judge twice in a single afternoon, unusual, given that their communication was typically routed through the clerk. One of those calls was intercepted under the authorized monitoring order we had obtained. Hale's voice was tight and controlled. He told the judge to stay calm. That there was nothing to worry about. That the next hearing was scheduled for Thursday and everything would go exactly as it always had. The judge's response was harder to hear on the recording. He said very little. But the call confirmed what I already suspected, there was another hearing coming. Another tenant. Another eviction built on fabricated evidence and a predetermined verdict. I requested the court schedule for Thursday. There it was. Courtroom 4B. 9 o'clock in the morning. The same judge. The same building. Victor Hale was not finished. And neither was I. I called Lydia that same evening. She answered on the first ring, which told me she had been waiting. I explained what we had found and what we were planning. I told her that a second eviction hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning, a different tenant from the same building, a man named George Abra who had lived in apartment 2A for 11 years. I told her I needed her in that courtroom. She was quiet for a moment. "You want me to watch it happen again," she said. "I want you there so you understand that this ends Thursday," I said. "But I need you to stay calm and stay in your seat, no matter what you see. Can you do that?" Another pause. Then, yes. I spent Wednesday working with the 2 investigators and a small technical support team. We prepared 3 concealed recording devices, 2 would be carried by officers positioned in the gallery, 1 by me. Our monitoring order covered audio recording within the public space of the courtroom. Every step had been reviewed by the department's legal team. We confirmed that the hidden camera footage from Albert's Drive had been formally submitted as evidence. The forensic accountant's analysis of the shell company transfers had been authenticated and filed. The intercepted phone call had been logged and approved for use. All 3 pieces of evidence, the footage, the financial records, the recorded call, were ready. What we did not have yet was the bribery exchange itself. Caught live, in the courtroom, with witnesses present. That part, we were about to get. Thursday arrived cold and overcast. I was in the courtroom by 8:30, seated in the 3rd row from the back. Lydia sat 2 seats to my left, her hands folded in her lap, her expression completely steady. The 2 officers with concealed recording devices were seated on opposite sides of the gallery, neither of them in uniform. George Abra sat at the defendant's table with a legal aid lawyer who looked young and slightly overwhelmed. He was a broad-shouldered man with reading glasses pushed to the top of his head, and he kept glancing toward the entrance as though expecting someone. Victor Hale arrived at 8:55 with 2 members of his legal team. He moved through the room with the same ease I had observed the week before, unhurried, comfortable, certain of the outcome. He did not look at the gallery. The hearing began at 9 exactly. Hale's lawyers presented a detailed record of damages, photographs, cost estimates, a written report from a property assessor. George's lawyer objected to the timing of the assessor's report, noting it had been filed less than 48 hours before the hearing. The judge overruled the objection without comment. Then, during a brief administrative pause, a short recess while the clerk organized exhibits, I watched carefully. Hale leaned forward at the plaintiff's table. His right hand moved beneath the bench, slow and deliberate. An envelope appeared between his fingers for no more than 2 seconds. Then it was gone, slipped flat beneath the raised edge of the judge's platform without a single word spoken between them. I stood up. Not quickly, not dramatically. I simply rose from my seat and moved into the aisle, walking forward at a steady pace. The recording devices were active. The other 2 officers were already alert. Hale sensed movement before he saw me. He turned from the plaintiff's table, and his expression shifted through several stages in under a second, mild curiosity, professional irritation, and then something else entirely. Recognition. He stared at my face, and I watched him recalculate. Something behind his eyes flickered. I had seen that same look before, when a person realizes a situation they believed was completely controlled has just developed an unpredictable variable. I stopped at the edge of the plaintiff's area, close enough for him to hear me clearly without raising my voice. The courtroom was still processing what was happening. A few spectators leaned forward. Lydia sat perfectly still. I looked directly at Hale and said, in a normal, conversational tone, "Sergeant Vivian Reeves, Branton Police Department." I let a half-second pass. I was the lead investigator on the Hale Properties case. Weston Park District. The file was suspended in 2004. The name of the case landed exactly as I had hoped. Hale's jaw tightened. The relaxed ease drained out of his posture like water from a glass. For the first time in what I suspected was a very long time, Victor Hale had nothing prepared to say. The judge looked up from the bench, suddenly rigid. The room went absolutely quiet. Hale recovered quickly. He was good at that. He straightened and looked around the room as though checking whether anyone important was watching. Then he produced a short, tight smile and said that he had no idea what I was referring to and that any interruption to an official court proceeding was a serious matter. His lawyer began to stand. I spoke calmly before either of them could build momentum. "This proceeding is being recorded as part of an active corruption investigation currently authorized by the district court," I said. "That authorization covers all audio and visual activity within this courtroom from 8 o'clock this morning." The room shifted. Some spectators looked toward the gallery doors. Others looked at the judge. The legal aid lawyer representing George Abra had gone very still and was watching everything closely. Hale's smile stayed fixed, but it had lost all warmth. "You have no grounds to," his lawyer began. The courtroom doors opened. 4 officers entered in plain clothes, each moving to a different position in the room. They were followed by 2 investigators from the District Corruption Unit, both carrying official identification. One of them made his way directly toward the judge's bench. The judge looked at the approaching investigator, then at Hale, then at the door, as though measuring distances. He said nothing. The officer assigned to the plaintiff's table stepped forward and asked Victor Hale to remain where he was. For the first time that morning, the courtroom belonged to someone other than the man in the dark blue suit. The judge tried to end the hearing. He reached for his gavel, declared the session suspended, and began to rise from his seat. The investigator from the corruption unit placed a single document on the bench in front of him, a formal notification of investigation, and asked him, politely but firmly, to remain seated. He sat. The financial evidence came first. Petra's analysis of the shell company transfers was presented in summary: 3 companies, dozens of transactions, all ultimately routed to an account held by the judge's sister-in-law. The investigator read the figures quietly and clearly. The dollar amounts were large enough that several people in the gallery audibly reacted. Hale's legal team was already on their phones. One of them moved toward the exit and was stopped by an officer near the door. The judge's composure began to crack. He straightened his papers several times. He removed his glasses, cleaned them, put them back on. He asked twice whether he could consult his personal attorney. Both times, he was told calmly that he could do so after the proceedings were formally paused under investigation protocol. And then the clerk, the same man I had seen accepting something from Hale outside the courtroom the previous week, stood up from his station to the left of the bench. Everyone in the room looked at him. He was pale. His hands were trembling. He said he wanted to make a statement. He said he had been keeping records. The judge finally stopped straightening his papers and looked, for the first time all morning, genuinely afraid. The clerk's name was Philip. He had worked in that courtroom for 14 years. He was not the first clerk Hale had used, he made that clear in the formal statement he gave later that afternoon, but he had been the most consistent over the past decade, and he had kept records throughout the entire time. Not because he had planned to come forward. Because he was afraid of what might happen to him if he did not have something to protect himself with. Philip had documented every payment, dates, amounts, method of delivery. He had kept a separate record of each case he had been instructed to influence, paperwork filed late, exhibits mislabeled, procedural delays inserted at critical moments. Each entry was dated. Each one corresponded to a Hale Properties eviction case. The scheme had been running for at least 18 years, according to his records. And it was not limited to the judge in courtroom 4B. 2 other judges had received payments over that period, one had since retired, one was still active in a different district, both would be investigated within the week. I placed the original case folder, the thin, worn document I had pulled from the records room basement, on the investigator's table beside Philip's entries. Side by side, the 2 sets of documents told a complete and undeniable story. The 2004 investigation had been deliberately suspended by someone with access to the filing system. The suspension order, we later confirmed, had been requested by a senior official with ties to Hale's legal team. 20 years of careful burying. Undone in a single Thursday morning, Victor Hale was arrested before noon. The formal charges were read outside the courthouse: bribery of a public official, fraud, criminal intimidation, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. His legal team surrounded him immediately, but the composure that had carried him through more than 20 years of untouchable arrogance was gone. His face was tight and colorless as the officers led him toward the vehicle. The judge was suspended from the bench pending a full judicial review. He was escorted from the building through a side entrance, away from the growing crowd of reporters that had gathered on the front steps after word spread. Philip was taken into formal protective custody pending cooperation with investigators. His records had been thorough enough to form the backbone of the prosecution's case, and the corruption unit was already treating them as primary evidence. By early afternoon, the case had drawn the attention of the regional media. I spoke briefly to the police press office about the public statement. I said as little as possible and let the facts do the talking. The tenants from the Weston Park building were notified that the investigation was active and that all eviction proceedings connected to Victor Hale's properties were under immediate legal review. But Lydia found me at the end of the day as officers were still clearing the courthouse area. She stood beside me for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "The eviction notices are still on our doors." She was right. An arrest was not yet a reversal. The legal process was only just beginning. I told her to hold on. The review moved faster than any of us expected. The regional court assigned a senior oversight judge to examine every eviction case connected to Victor Hale's properties over the previous 15 years. Philip's records made the review straightforward. Each fraudulent case was matched to a corresponding entry in his documentation, then cross-referenced against the financial transfers Petra had traced. Within 3 weeks, 43 eviction orders were formally declared invalid and vacated. Lydia's case was among the first to be cleared. George Abra's was cleared the same day. Raymond Carter's original case, the one that had started everything, the one that my predecessor's generation of officers had allowed to be buried, was added to the review even though the statute of limitations had long passed. It would not produce legal remedy for what had been done to him all those years ago. But it would be officially recorded as a fraudulent proceeding. Which meant that his family would finally know the truth. That Lydia would know it. That her father had not walked away. He had been beaten by a system that was designed to beat him. The two other judges identified in Philip's records were placed under formal investigation. One had retired 6 years earlier. The process for pursuing accountability after retirement was slower, but it had begun. In the 4th week of the investigation, I uncovered something I had not expected. One of the shell company accounts had been used to fund the suppression of the original 2004 file. The suspension was not administrative oversight or bureaucratic neglect. Someone had been paid specifically to make sure that case never reopened. And now we had their name. 6 months later, I drove back to the Weston Park district on a quiet Saturday morning. The building looked different somehow, not in any obvious physical way, just in the atmosphere around it. The eviction notices were long gone. Flower pots had returned to the windowsills on the upper floors, and someone had planted a short row of shrubs along the front path that had not been there before. A new intercom panel had been fitted beside the entrance. New management. New beginning. Albert was sitting on the bench near the front door when I arrived. He raised a hand when he saw me coming, the way a person does when they were already expecting someone. We talked for a while. He told me that most of the tenants had stayed. A few had chosen to leave on their own terms after everything settled, which was entirely their right. But the ones who had been threatened into silence were still there, living their lives in the same building they had always called home. Lydia came down a few minutes later with her son. He was slightly taller than I remembered. She thanked me, and I told her the same thing I always told people in situations like this, that I had simply done my job. But we both knew it had been more than that. Back in my car, I opened the old folder one final time. I looked at Raymond Carter's name on the witness sheet, held the page for a moment, then slowly closed the file. I placed it on the passenger seat. On Monday, I would return it to the records room, properly closed this time, with a resolution attached. If this story reminded you that justice sometimes takes far longer than it should, but one person who refuses to forget can change everything, then subscribe and drop a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Every quiet fight like this one deserves to be remembered.